There's also something you explore in the book, and that's the data that actually shows that our incarceration rates actually increases criminality.
Sure. This is a really important point because ostensibly the expectation is that people are arrested and if convicted, put in prison to reduce the amount of crime in society. But there's increasing evidence that spending time in prison can have what's referred to as a criminogenic effect. And the idea here is that if you're surrounded by a population of others who have committed a crime, and that's what your experiences are day in, day out, year after year, while you serve a sentence, the likelihood of committing a crime again upon release is actually higher. And I can elaborate on one of the studies I cite in the book that illustrates that. Would that be helpful?
Absolutely.
Sure. So there was a sentencing change in California where there was a new classification to certain crimes. And so the type of prison that individuals would go to was going to be new under the new classification system. And so as this was being implemented, certain individuals were assigned to the old classification system, others to the new. And so this was kind of a testing period of this change in policy. And so it was random who got which system during this testing period. And so what the researchers were able to do was say, okay, the crimes that were committed were roughly equivalent. The individuals were roughly equivalent because it was random whether they were sentenced under the old system or the new system. And so these researchers then compared what type of prison did the individuals go to. Again, the crime was the same. It was just random, sentenced under the old system or the new system. And those sentenced to the maximum security prison instead of the medium security, so this is a harsher incarceration situation, were more likely to commit a crime and be sent back to prison sooner. And again, the type of crimes were identical. It was just whether the sentencing was under the old or new system. And this type of analysis is really some of the most compelling evidence of this potential criminogenic effect.
One of the examples, just to kind of even step back a little bit further, an example you give in the introduction, and you give a couple, but of kind of our overly punitive nature here. You give this thing right in the beginning of the book of a man who got 25 to life for stealing like $150 worth of like VHS videotapes in like the 90s at a Kmart. And because of these like 3-strike laws, like all of his stuff was very small crimes. He got because of the way these sentencing laws are put into place, this man's going to spend the rest of his life, at least 25 years before he's even eligible for parole, but such a massive amount of time in jail for literally like $100 of VHS tapes. I mean, we don't even have VHS tapes anymore, and like this man's going to spend the rest of his life in jail for stealing something that doesn't even like exist in like culture anymore. It's insane.
Yeah, no, that you're exactly right. And that's California's 3 strikes law. And so it was, he had been convicted of 2 previous felonies. And so just like you described, goes to a Kmart, shoplifts a couple of VHS tapes. And one of the most stunning aspects of this to me was he was caught in the act. A store security guard catches him. So he never even left the store. The security guard calls the police. He's arrested. But he's allowed to let go. He then has a court date. And then about 2 weeks later, he goes to a different Kmart a couple miles away, tries the same thing, another couple of VHS tapes, again caught in the act. So now he has 2 counts of stealing VHS tapes. The total across both stores, as you mentioned, about $150. And so then the prosecutor chooses to prosecute these under the California 3 strikes law. And so because it's 2 instances, but each one about $75 worth of videotapes, it ends up a 50-year to life sentence. And so, yeah, just a really vivid example of the punitiveness. Now, another part of the story is I mentioned that the public's becoming less punitive. So voters in California have recently voted to scale back this three strikes law. So now the third strike has to be what they're considering an extreme felony, so a violent felony. So this case, this specific example, if it happened today, would no longer be classified as a third strike. And so it was California voters who pushed the three strikes law in such a punitive direction to begin with, but they've also scaled it back some. Now, that doesn't mean California is not a punitive state. It just means it's less punitive than at the time.
Well, before I let you go, circling back around to kind of the main core of the book, that all of this stems from, it's not just politicians, it's not just high up people who are dictating this. It's actually the core of, and actually this makes it a little more, some ways more sad, and seems like the work is actually much, much harder, where it's so much of the American public has this sort of punitive sense and this punitive streak to them. In the book, you do have hope of what's going on in the future. So what actually gives you hope that we can change our insane incarceration system in the United States?
Yeah, sure. And yeah, and on one hand, it is somewhat troubling, because in a democracy, we think that our political leaders should follow the public. And here's an instance where following the public has led to the highest incarceration rate in the world. And as I mentioned with education example, that's problematic for everyone in this country. But the positive aspect is, if the public got us here, the public can change things. And as I mentioned, there's evidence now that that's already the case. And we see that somewhat with politics today, where we see examples of both Democrats and Republicans coming together and calling for criminal justice reform. So we live in a very politically polarized country, but when you see politicians from both parties coming together around criminal justice reform, that shows that despite the political polarization, they're responding to the shifting the public's decline in punitiveness. And again, another positive aspect, if it is just politicians or political leaders doing what they want, it's really hard to even think about changing it. But if the public has agency, as I describe in the book, if we recognize the public has control, then members of the public can take responsibility and recognize that when their opinion shifts on this issue, they can expect politicians to respond, because that's what's been going on for the last 50 years and more. So the public has the ability to shape what happens on this issue.